Arts Roundup with Simon Bertin on Cambridge 105 Radio.
Hello, I'm Simon Bertin and welcome to Cambridge Arts Roundup, an hour where we'll explore heady subjects such as the philosophy of creativity, meet an artist challenging much of what we take for granted in modern life with satirical work, and drop in on an open studio to hear about colourful, engaging paintings. In this edition, I visit Dr. Alex Carter, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Fitzwilliam College, to educate myself on the philosophy of creativity and humour and the problems it raises. We encounter artist, musician and short filmmaker Taryn McCallan-Moore at his Cambridge Gallery and find rewarding deep thought on the life of a satirical artist who knows the rules and how to break them in an entertaining way. And we make a studio visit to abstract painter Charlotte Cornish, who talks on recent work with environmental themes as she opens studios and meets the public. When we look at the subject of creative genius, both in artists and scientists who've experienced it and produced great works, we find they simply can't explain what happened as a perplexing puzzle, and this interests philosophers seeking to examine its traits and features through the ages as something crucial to our humanity. In a recent encounter, I found myself thinking about creativity's very essence and felt I needed to investigate further with an expert on how to approach the topic. Dr. Alex Carter, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Fitzwilliam College at the University of Cambridge, says philosophy can sometimes be hard to get to grips with, but it offers great clarity over the thinking issues. We're kind of ready to talk about the philosophy of creativity as the first topic. A broad consensus that creativity is the capacity to produce things that are original and valuable. Would you agree with that?
I certainly don't oppose any definition of creativity, which sounds like I'm sitting on the fence, but there's a specific reason why creativity shouldn't be defined, or at least not defined definitively. So I don't mind Margaret Boden's definition and various other definitions that are similar to that. The problem with it is the minute you say that is what creativity is, the first creative act will be to do something creative that isn't in line with that definition. There are examples of great artworks that didn't do something new, but took something and made it superlative, and that can be just as creative, I think.
How would you answer the question, what is creativity, then, if it's different?
So I can lecture you endlessly about this topic, but if I'm looking for a succinct answer, I would say it's serious play, which I know is a trademark term with Lego. That's fine, but it's a theory that I align myself with.
How, in your view, did the philosophy of creativity begin? How the sort of edifice of thought about it actually first started, which goes back to ancient Greece, doesn't it?
This is a really great question. So when we teach a course on creativity theory at the Institute of Continuing Education, and we go through it historically, and the earliest notions of creation are often where the seeds of our understanding of creativity come from. Creativity is a very new word. It's only really started to appear in the 1950s. So creation, the idea of something coming from nothing, kind of breaks our mind. It makes us think in these really difficult ways. Slowly that evolved into this idea that it wasn't just gods who could create, it was geniuses inspired by God who could create. And then, sort of as democracy took action in politics in the West and became liberal Western democracy, you started to see this idea that anyone can create. It became a democratized concept. So creativity as a capacity that we can all develop started to be talked about.
Now, what about, where are ideas about the divine spark and the divine imagination, and this kind of idea that in a state of heightened awareness you kind of touch heaven and you acquire the seeds of genius from that? How does that end up in the philosopher's mind?
So this is a wonderful idea. So a lovely example would be Archimedes getting in his bath and having his famous eureka moment as he realizes that water displacement would solve a particular engineering difficulty that he's having. Now, interestingly, he didn't get in the bath in order to have that thought. He didn't bring the thought about. The thought occurred to him, not because of him. He didn't bring it about. However, we've also got to factor in the idea that it had to occur to him. If he'd got in the bath and someone else had had the idea of how to solve his problem, we'd be puzzled. We'd find that very strange. So there's a kind of medio-passive, what we call medio-passive notion here. A little bit like getting married. It's something that you do, but it's also something that's being done to you. Yeah. And so creativity has that same hinterland experience where it's the ideas strike me. I don't strike upon the idea.
Plato believed in divine inspiration, didn't he?
He did, certainly, and the idea of muses, for instance, inspiring us. In particular, this idea, I think, comes from... So Kant later developed this idea to say that science can't be creative. And this annoys many of my scientist students, but the reason they're annoyed is because they think that he's saying scientists can't be creative. What Kant was saying was that science itself can't be creative. The rules exist out there. They don't exist because we make them true. Whereas art imposes rules on nature. So if you're imposing a rule on nature, you're an artist and you can be a creative genius. If you're taking the rule from nature, then you're a scientist and you can be a scientific genius.
What about the genius of Einstein? Because obviously a mathematician can go in practically any direction, and then they can have moments when they just create the most amazing things, like obviously Einstein's E equals mc squared, a moment of genius.
So where scientific inspiration comes from, crucially, scientists can't tell you, just as artists can't tell you where their inspiration comes from. They'll explain what the inspiration might have been, but they can't explain why that was the inspiration. I think Einstein's a good example. He appealed to philosophy actually a couple of times, and in particular he said, I believe in Spinoza's God. He said Spinoza's God is not God as we typically understand it. It's this kind of impassive, algorithmic nature of the world. So it's the unfolding of a mathematical equation, as it were. And so Einstein's E equals mc squared, the idea that you would find something so simple and so perfect within nature makes you think, but it must have come from somewhere. There must be some sort of design to this. And I can imagine that pull. But of course, what Einstein is saying by saying, I believe in Spinoza's God, is not it was created that way, but there's this wonderful act of creation taking place within the world.
Nietzsche saw the greatest feats of creativity exemplified in the tragic poetry of ancient Greece as being born out of a rare cooperation between the Dionysian spirit of ecstatic intoxication, which imbues the work with vitality and passion, and the Apollonian spirit of sober restraint, which tempers chaos in order and form. And this has to be the barest glimpse of what each of the philosophers had to say about creativity, and many other figures could be added to their number. Now, this came from a paper I was reading earlier. What would you say to that?
So, firstly, Nietzsche is a major inspiration for me. It's where I get the notion of serious play from. So when I read Nietzsche, he gave this rather innocuous comment. He said, maturity means regaining the seriousness one had as a child at play. Now, there's certain key terms in there. Firstly, the seriousness of children at play. Children are very serious when they're playing. But this idea of regaining it, and that's what leads to maturity. Notice he doesn't use the word creativity, but what I took from that was he was saying, once you take on a role and can no longer pick it up or put it down, you're not serious anymore. So very quickly, there's a lovely anecdote that I tell where a child is playing with a little toy knight. As he's playing with it, he's very serious. His parent comes up to him and says, is that a real knight? He snaps out of it and says, no, this is not a real knight. 30 years later, he is a knight. He's become a knight. And he's riding on his horse wearing a suit of armour, and someone says to him, are you a real knight? And he says, yes. And Nietzsche would say this is where he's lost seriousness. He's not the child playing with the knight. He is the knight, i.e. he's the toy. maturity and this kind of idea of serious play means we can pick up and put down roles rather. We can be the teacher or the student or whatever, and we can sort of set aside those roles at any given time. Nietzsche's appeal to the Dionysian and the Apolline is this idea that we're appealing to this kind of playfulness, but also this kind of seriousness. And I think it's the interplay between those two elements that gives rise to creativity.
Okay, so what would you say in terms of looking at the philosophy of creativity are the pearls of wisdom that have come out of that study? Because obviously if someone's going to engage in the philosophy of creativity, they want to find things that they can say, yes, that holds true beautifully, like I think, therefore I am, or what have you.
Oh, so yes, you're asking me for the soundbite, aren't you? No, this is possible. So Simone Weil is one of my favourite theologians, and when I was saying that creativity arises out of a theology, her particular theology is the idea that God didn't create the world in this glorious act of will. What he did was he allowed the world to come to be. And this is also experienced by creatives. So that notion of creation can find its home in a certain theory of creativity, where an author doesn't guide their characters through the plot, they allow the character and the plot to unfold according to their own rules. So they're sort of letting something else come to be. Jackson Pollock's paintings are a beautiful example of this, or of allowing the painting to make itself.
I was going to say, I mean, looking at Picasso's work, how would you explain that as a philosopher? Because what he's looking into, I mean, something like Guernica, is the world within and the darker workings of the mind, but he does it in such a way that we can relate to it. How would you explain what's going on there?
So on the one hand, I mean, Picasso is much better at me at the soundbite, by the way, because he delivered this wonderful soundbite, if he really did deliver it, because often quotes are attributed to Picasso or attributed to Einstein, they're not really from them. But Picasso allegedly said, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. And this is that idea of the kind of Apolline, learn the rules, the sort of intellectual parameters of your craft, and he did. He worked very intricately. He was a perfectionist around his style and his craft. But he also broke rules. He was also breaking with the tradition. He was willing to challenge the people of the day to do something fundamentally different.
Do the rules basically say it's something like this, but we're not quite sure? But that's if you take that as your starting point, then you won't go wrong as you indulge in the creative purpose.
One of my colleagues puts this beautifully. He says every artist is working to an ideal. They just don't know what it is. And I think that's perfect, right? So it's this idea that that's not quite right yet. But if you said, but what should it look like then? You would say, oh, I don't know. I just haven't arrived at it yet. But I've got the sense of something. So there's a kind of intuitive mysticism around creativity, which is why definitions are slightly problematic. Why going back to this idea that if we would reduce it to a certain set of concepts, there's a problem there, because intuition means that we have to move around things, between things. You have to be bigger than the sum of the parts. Yeah.
To kick the ball into today, I was reading some stuff from Margaret Bowden saying that AI, could a computer-based system ever really be creative? Because if we're going to do things like that, this leads to interesting philosophical issues about what constitutes real creativity. With some qualifications, she argues that real creativity involves autonomy, intentionality, valuation, emotion, and consciousness.
I have some fairly strong views on AI and creativity. I am a pessimist when it comes to AI, which means I'm an optimist about human creativity. And where this comes from is partly rooted in phenomenology. So there's a particular phenomenologist called Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and he argues that there is the manufactured in human beings and there is also the natural in human beings, and you can't really disambiguate those two things, whereas there is only the manufactured in artificial intelligence. The reason that's important is because when we create AI, we're not creating AI to think like us, we're creating AI that thinks like we think. And I know that sounds really obtuse and very philosophical. It's not. It's just an extra level of detail. The point is, AI is logical from the start. We create the logic and then it builds a logic on top of that logic and so on. We aren't logical all the way down. We are biological first. So the bio logic gives rise to a logic. If you open my head, you don't find ones and zeros, you find grey mush. Somehow out of that grey mush comes ones and zeros that I can then impute into AI. But it's always our thinking at a distance. But the point is, not everything I do is thought. I can do things that are not thinking. So I can simply act. And this is fundamentally important and something I think that has gone out of discussions around AI. One other thing I will say about AI is, I think unfortunately at this moment we're in a race to the middle. I think we can make AI as good as human beings, but what we'll typically do, what we'll typically bring about to make that happen is that we'll make AI better and humans worse. One good example of this is the Google effect on the brain. Google hasn't existed all my life, but by using AI, my brain has become more molded to finding solutions rather than solving problems. And this is good news in a way, right? Because if Google went away, my brain would go back. There is a plasticity in our brains. And this again speaks to this idea of the biological giving rise to the logical. There is a possibility that we could meet aliens that have a different logic to us. There is no chance of us meeting an AI that has a different logic to us. So it's just our thinking at a distance.
Why should we be interested in the philosophy of creativity? What will it solve for us? What will it deliver? How will it help us take positions in thinking about such a thing in a way that benefits us?
So I think firstly, the fact that we don't fully understand how we think. The second problem is that we don't really understand creativity, and the third problem is, weirdly, since we made it, we don't really understand AI. So I think understanding what those three things are is important. If you operate with faulty assumptions about what something is, typically you'll go wrong from that starting point. The other thing I would say is philosophers aren't very technical. I don't know about coding, so when I give a lecture on AI and creativity, I'll often say to the audience, I don't know if this is correct, but tell me if I'm wrong. And I have since spoken to many different people. So the important thing about philosophy is that it engages between disciplines. Computer scientists aren't talking to philosophers unless a philosopher comes and talks to them. So I think it's really important that we have these conversations across disciplines between different people. There's a wonderful quote from Jerome Brunner who says that creativity is not about extra productivity. Any instrumental justification we offer for being more creative is a justification after the fact. What he says is the real value of creativity is that it can bring us to a new dignity. But the minute you ask, what is that new dignity, you're literally lost for words.
Surely the prize of creativity and also the discussion about the philosophy of creativity is about attaining genius, because that seems to me to be the thing that people want to reach for most of all.
There is a lot of discussion at the moment around whether or not we need polymaths. And this is an interesting question, because I think one thing you'll note, especially if you look at the philosophy tradition going back for the last, say, 200 years, there are fewer and fewer geniuses. And by that I mean these kind of magnificent individuals that we hold up. I mean, we talk about Derrida being perhaps the last one, perhaps we might talk about Derek Parfit being one, we might talk about Wittgenstein being one, but the 20th century isn't replete with them in the way that, for the 19th century was or the 18th century was. And I wonder if partly this is because we've moved to a different space where creativity is collaborative, it's about institutions, it's about groups. So great breakthroughs. If I ask, for instance, who discovered gravitation waves, we don't have a name. We could Google it, and I'm sure names would come up. But the point is, we don't call that name to mind, and they aren't going to go be the same person like Einstein who went on to discover yet more things. It's a team that are working on this thing for a very long period of time with focused investment. That's typically how we make breakthroughs today. So genius, I think, is changing in its focus, and I think polymathy really should be replaced with interdisciplinarity. I think if you're becoming dogmatic, you're not being creative. So I think anything where you say, this is creativity, immediately start thinking, but why might it not be? I don't say that for everything. I know that sounds like the equivocation that happens often in academia. Trust me, I am the person who pushes back on students who will often equivocate and say, well, a little from column A, a little from column B. With creativity, I think it's precisely that quality of not settling on a particular idea that makes it so valuable. It's being able to move around things, like I say, being playful and moving between things. If you said, for instance, what is a joke, and defined it very specifically as a very specific kind of joke, the next joke that would come along would be one that subverts that. So subversion, I think, is crucial to creativity, being subversive in your thinking.
Yeah.
One of my wonderful colleagues here in Cambridge, Nathan Crilly, who's an engineer, says that creativity should be probably defined negatively as an avoidance of fixation. And I agree with him. I agree that if you're looking at habits of mind, which doesn't sound very creative, does it? Because the word habit makes us think of things that become entrenched and don't change, given what I just said about the fact that we have to move around and be playful. But habits of mind can be either closed down or they can be opening up. If you're inquisitive, for instance, if you're self-questioning, if you're exploratory, if you are willing to diverge and converge in different ways, this is probably what makes you creative. The problem is, though, how do you develop those particular habits of mind? One of the most difficult to develop, even though it is, according to Bill Lucas, one of the habits of mind that we need to develop, and I agree with him on this, is perseverance or persistence. But how do you develop perseverance or persistence? If someone gives up at a certain point, maybe it's because they found the solution, or maybe it's because it can't be solved. How do you then say, but you should have persisted more? Well, maybe you can't. There's a good example of this, actually. One of my students was worked in a tech company, and he'd have big tech companies come to him and say, we'd like you to develop an app. Here's £1 million. And he'd say, but I don't know if this is actually possible. And they'd say, okay, here's £2 million. He'd say, that hasn't helped. I mean, it's great, give me all the money in the world, but the problem hasn't gone away. It still might not be possible. And interestingly, he took my course precisely to try and find out, how can I respond to that kind of business mentality? And he came up with his answer, but I won't spoiler it, so...
You found us. This is Cambridge 105.
Humour, for the philosopher, is humour the joker in the pack? Because philosophers are generally quite serious-minded people, and humour is, obviously valued very highly by people like Aristotle, as being absolutely essential to our humanity in the same way that creativity is. Tell me a little bit about the philosophy of humour and laughter, because obviously it's a subject which you've studied quite a lot on.
I'm going to take your joke about the Joker in the pack, and I'm going to see you and raise you and say, I start my philosophy of humour always with the same joke. I know, I'm very unoriginal. The joke runs like this: the unexamined life might not be worth living, but the examined joke is probably not worth telling. And I do warn people, and I think it is worth warning listeners right now, that the possibility is that we'll just ruin a lot of jokes. Because explaining jokes and trying to articulate why they're funny isn't very funny. But it is very interesting, and I think there is this real problem in philosophy that we don't deal seriously with unserious things, even though we absolutely can and should. Sociologists do, psychologists do. I don't know why philosophers don't engage more with this question of humour. Luckily, in the last 150 years or so, we have done, but for the last 2,500 years, it's been a rather desert of discussion when it comes to philosophy of humour.
That's strange, because it's interested, obviously, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Hobbes, Kant, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Bergson, Freud, and many others, as a topic which they felt that it was absolutely essential, but they couldn't really form ideas about it. Now, there are some particular schools of thought about that: superiority theory, relief theory, and incongruity theory. Tell me about those.
So I'll explain a little bit what I mean by a desert. So there have been two kinds of responses when it comes to humour by philosophers. One is that it's this superiority. It's a sense of superiority. It's making fun of people, and so it's been viewed as this kind of nasty thing that we need to stop doing. On the other hand, it's been seen as this sublime thing, which is too important to talk about. Bertrand Russell, when he first read Henry Bergson's paper on laughter, which was really the first proper, serious, engaged, happy, but serious engagement with humour, Bertrand Russell said it's too important to write about. Here's a philosopher who can write about God, about truth, about free will and ethics, but he's unwilling to talk philosophically about humour, because just don't go there. Please don't try and talk about humour in a philosophical way. So there is this sort of ill fit between them, and it does date back to Plato in particular, who saw Socrates made fun of by Aristophanes in the clouds. He was this fool who's carried around in a basket saying silly things, and then he was on trial. And he's got to persuade an audience who has also seen this play that he's a serious individual. This was much harder. And then, of course, you've got the Christian church that picks up these same ideas and says, laughter and jokes are often a subversion of things. They're an inversion. So, for instance, things like upside down crosses, black candles, talking backwards, all of these things are then seen as evil. So humour doesn't really get a go of it. And then you get to the Enlightenment and you've got people like Kant who also don't like humour, because if you're laughing at Kant, you're not taking him seriously. So he doesn't want you to laugh at him either. And so we really do have to wait, yet again, like creativity, we have to wait until it's democratised, until it's something that everyone can talk about. And only then do we start to see people philosophising about it. I would say that laughter is definitely remedial. It's definitely therapeutic. Just like philosophy has often been described as therapeutic. It's contemplative. It's about stepping back. Wonderful philosopher Simon Critchley, who's written a lot about humour, says philosophers and comedians are similar in one regard. We're both like Martians coming to the world for the first time. We see something and we say, oh, how strange that is, even though it's perfectly familiar to most people. Equally, we can take something incredibly strange and say, well, let's imagine it's perfectly familiar. So seeing the strange as familiar and the familiar as strange is what William James, as a psychologist and a philosopher, said is what philosophy is doing. Arguably, it's also what humour is doing. So there is this, I think, cathartic experience of being able to step back and say, this is traumatic, and actually say, well, actually, viewed in detail, it's quite funny. Again, this is a Schopenhauerian idea that we want to think of ourselves as tragic heroes, but actually, if you look at what's tragic about us, so for instance, I'm a businessman, my business is going under, this is incredibly tragic and very sad, we could lose our home, we might get kicked out, this is really, really drastic, and yet at the same time, my job is selling plastic lobsters. And so I've got to sell more plastic lobsters. How can I get people to buy plastic lobsters? Well, let's talk about Dali. So the idea that we kind of have to move around in these kind of tiny little silly ways is what gives rise to the meaning in our life. And I think, again, this is what philosophy should be engaging with. Humour gives meaning to a lot of people's lives. We find humour very, very meaningful. The Meaning of Life by Monty Python. There's a reason why they called it The Meaning of Life and could make fun about things like death. The fact that we can engage with those sorts of difficult topics with humour, and yet people don't really necessarily want to do it when a philosopher comes up to you and says, let's talk about death. That should tell us something. It should tell us that perhaps we could be engaging with humour in a serious way. There's one of my most challenging and yet most interesting quotes from Ludwig Wittgenstein, is the quote, a good and serious philosophical work could be written consisting entirely of jokes or questions. And the fact that he said that is so telling. I mean, here we have an Austrian Jew in Britain who's trying to learn not just English as a language, but also to joke in English. And you could imagine him finding this very difficult. He gives a few examples of this where he says someone not understanding your joke is like you throw them a ball, expecting them to throw it back to you, and instead they just put it in their top pocket. So, but you haven't understood the game. And so you could imagine, you can now see him almost doing these jokes with Bertrand Russell, who was very funny, had a very lively wit, and yet struggling to get the joke or see the joke. And so Wittgenstein finding that very interesting. It is often the last thing we learn in language. Why? Because we have to learn the rules of a language in order to learn which rules can be broken.
Now, Wittgenstein particularly interests you. Why is that, and what was his view on humour?
So Wittgenstein was a philosopher of language, principally. I'm most interested in his later work, and Wittgenstein talks about humour almost as a way of seeing indirectly the rules that we don't even realise we're following. So I had a wonderful experience of this when a student came to me after my philosophy of humour class, my very first time I was teaching it, and said, I always used to laugh when my father, who ran a menswear shop, would say, we've run out of green men's socks. And I said, is that because no green men ever came in the shop? And he went, that's why it's funny. He understood the joke. He went, I understand it now. I get it. I always got it because I always laughed. And what I like about that is it shows that humour works at this very basic level of we can get a joke without understanding a joke. When we understand a joke, it can make it better, it can make it worse. But typically what's going on is we're not laughing in response to a thought. We're laughing in response to a much more subversive form of communication. There's one person pointed out to me wonderfully that humour and violence are very similar. They're both non-rational ways of getting persuasion. The last work that Mark Twain wrote, and actually didn't finish writing, was The Chronicles of Young Satan. And in that, the young Satan says, why have you used weapons of mass destruction and violence to attack each other when a joke would have done the trick? When you could have just blasted them to smithereens with a one-liner? And there is this element to it that it has the potential to persuade you, to bring you round to a different view non-rationally, not through, oh, you're right about that. That's what arguments are for. But actually, they very rarely persuade you. It's usually a joke that's more likely to persuade you. And I sense a lot of this is important in, for instance, discussing politics and satire, and which is why I'm a little bit troubled by the fact that we've been described as living in a post-satire era, where politicians, they're perfectly happy to be this kind of laughable figure if it means that they can subvert any kind of rational conversation or debate. You can't ask a clown for their reasons to do something. I had a student who was a clown, actually. She worked with a very famous clown whose Broadway show was going to be shut down. So big suits were coming in to say, you haven't been making enough money, we're going to close your show down. Well, the way in which he won against the suits, because he was finding it so hard to have these kind of legal disputes with them, is he dressed up as himself, i.e. as a clown, and came to the meeting. And they could do nothing with that. They couldn't discuss it, debate it, so his show went on.
Thank you very much indeed for spending some time to talk to Cambridge 105. I'm sure everyone's enjoyed listening to it. It's been absolutely great. Dr. Alex Carter, thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon.
Taking a walk on the wild side and then expressing it in satirical art and humour is something that we have a large appetite for in Britain, not least having dined well on Terry Gilliam's Monty Python offerings, but there are other fish in the pond experimenting with the mind's diversity. I've just encountered a self-confessed Etonian purple child. He's an artist, musician, filmmaker and comedian who creates satirical artwork which targets and subverts modern culture as often being both absurd and meaningless, and especially in terms of the banal nature of many computer games. He says what's important in life is to leave each encounter with a stranger or viewing audience having enlightened them in some small but meaningful way, changing perspectives and giving food for new and interesting thought. Taryn McAllen-Moore runs a private gallery in Cambridge and showed me his work, music and film skits, which capture moments of subversive thinking and challenging humour. They're very fun, and they're typically British things that you do, and I think that's great. I don't think there's enough comedy at the moment being produced, and also being daring enough to experiment with comedy ideas that are off the wall. It seems to me to be a good thing. I mean, how do you feel about that?
I think with regards to really interesting, kind of nuanced satire, there's a huge lack of that. I think what there is consistently is a kind of endless simulacra of humour, you know, and it's not challenging. I think broadcasters are, especially the corporate broadcasters, I think they're very, 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 very kind of hands-on, you know, because they're afraid of being sued, right? Because people are so afraid of anything you're going to say that's, you know, not appropriate, and it makes for a very prohibitive environment, you know. I mean, I think my first, I remember exactly the very first time I came across Monty Python, because I used to hear about it. You know, Monty Python's Flying Circus, and I thought, circus, I do not want to sit down and watch a circus, so I ignored it for a long time. There was this little tiny beautiful Sony TV, little black one. I mean, in fact, I've still got it downstairs, and you know, and I remember sitting at the end of this long corridor in this, you know, house that I grew up in Suffolk, and you know, turning it on, watching it, and going, my God, this is incredible, you know, and then. I used to go. I was always sort of living between Suffolk and London, and we had a house in London, and also because my father, my mother had a house in West London, and my father had a house in Pimlico, and I used to go and see him. And I remember coming across this book. It was called The Big Blue Book by Monty Python, and that when I first opened that, it was like, what? This is absolutely amazing. It just blew me away. It was just so, it was epiphanous, you know. And the one thing that always sticks with me, the inference is that Raphael's trying to draw the hand of this sort of Madonna figure, and you know, consistently getting it wrong. And it just at the end there's this shit, you know, and it's just brilliant. I just thought how wonderful that is, and I think. Actually, that was, you know, I think it was my first sort of introduction to that sort of irreverence.
Are you also a rebeller against the mundane, against the ordinary, against assumptions, against conventions?
Profoundly.
That seemed to me one of the things that struck me about the kind of artwork that you do. I mean, you do art, you do music, you do artist installations, and you do bits of performance art, which is aimed at a particular style of comedy that kind of mocks the absurd, it mocks the mundane, and all of those things. And in a way, in a slightly similar way to Monty Python.
Yeah, I mean, you know, they were very anti-establishment, of course. You know, I mean, they you know, they're establishment guys. You know, they you know, they come from that, and indeed, I do too. You know, and you know, there's you know, there's nothing like knowing your enemy intimately, and not to suggest that I have any enemies or I wish to have any enemies, you know. And I think the greatest defence against authoritarianism is to smile in a way, you know. And I think I think it was Marcus Aurelius, and I have to paraphrase, and it's an uncertainty actually as to whether it was Marcus Aurelius who said this, which was, you know, when death smiles at you, you must smile back, you know. And what I'm concerned with is well, I think firstly, you know, for me personally, empirically, practice is a very subjective experience. I have absolutely no interest in reflecting what it is that is the sum total of the shoulders of giants that I stand on. And of course, one has to respect that. One has to always, and I think every generation experiences this. Always, you fight against that, and it's a difficult exercise. I mean, I think that, you know, the American painter Philip Guston is always so eloquent about that experience. My understanding of art in my own, you know, particular experience, and I think it's generic amongst sort of people who practice, and aren't afraid to kind of be embarrassed, if you like, is that it's a medicine, right? First and foremost, and then when that's done, it's done, right? And the production of that, the object in whatever shape or form that happens to be, whether it's sort of three-dimensional object, or painting in a very sort of conventional manner, or whether it's the written word, or whether it's a film, or whatever it is, it then belongs to the world, right? And that then begins its kind of independent sentience, and that's the wonder is for me is. Being sort of fed by the sort of potency of other people's interpretations of what you do. That's the life of it. That's the living of it. And the worst thing you can ever do as an artist is to be didactic. You must not be afraid to do things that you do not understand. I don't understand what I do. I never begin with the premise. I never begin with any kind of paradigm. I just sort of allow this dialogue to take place, and then one is. I mean, I think Guston says it well. He said that, there's something like there's like 20 minutes or half an hour at the beginning of any process where you have a kind of independence, and after that you're subject to this internal logic that imposes itself upon you. I mean, it's a respectful process, but he said that there's a morality to it. You have to work for this, and at some point or other you must compromise because you have to stop doing it. But he said ultimately, the ridiculous thing about that sort of process, especially in the sort of modernist context in which he was practicing, something can go on forever, right? It can go on forever and ever. But you have to kind of, you have that sort of coda. Well, it is on the limit of didacticism in a way, because not in the purest sense, but because it pushes people in a certain direction. I don't want people to be in any direction at all. I want them to interpret them without a kind of influence or any inference, or So you mentioned those titles, and I certainly the whole inverted. I can respond to because I know exactly which one that is. I had a friend of mine called Loretto, who was around at the very, very beginning of this project, which is in October 22nd. It's 2 years, and she's a dancer and choreographer, and she's a lovely lady, so she was with who's that artist who has the Angel in the North? Gormley. Thank you. So Gormley's daughter had this massive space in central Cambridge, and just off Trinity, and she invited me to sort of have the space for 2 weeks, I think it was, and I thought, okay, I'm not quite sure what inspired it, but anyway, I went to one of the universities and I said, "Can I have 300 chairs, please?" And I got these chairs, and I put one down, and then I put another one to it, and I put another one to it, and I just kind of found, these there were so, there's so many variables to a chair, right? And you put two chairs together, and then you put three chairs together, and it's like sort of an architectural process in a way. It's a structural process. It's a sort of an aleatory engineering. You know what I mean?
There were something like 90 chairs or 60 chairs. How many chairs?
I think it was 300.
300, because it's a very big.
Yeah. I mean, it went all the way up to the ceiling, and it was a wonderful process, and I did it with a fury. It was a really wonderful kind of thing to do, and. What was interesting, of course, is that over time, this thing kind of creaked and rocked and rolled, and it sort of sunk into itself. But it remained integral. It was quite a dignified sort of mashup, But people were fascinated by it. It was wonderful.
I mean, one of the things that I noticed about that is it kind of gave you a sense of a being of some sort.
Gosh, yes.
And you like doing that, don't you? Dealing with beings of one sort or another. I mean, lots of your artwork seems to have that element to it. And also, you had this. One of your works looked as though it was similar, but not exactly like a rat trap with blood coming out of it. And that was also an interesting one to have a look at.
Yes. You're talking about the whole inverted and how it has this sort of, it's almost this sort of physical presence, and absolutely. I mean, we naturally anthropomorphise, don't we? I mean, and the very nature of naming things in a way is sort of we incorporate things into us, and for example, we will describe a disease as being callous and all that sort of stuff. But reality is a construction, consensually, collectively anthropocentric, and it's not an outward reality that we then perceive. It's an internal reality that we project, and all of these things around us, and it's anomalous actually with regards to our there's no total understanding of it. It is a mystery. But I look at that fridge and I say it's white, and you look at that fridge and you say it's white. Now, I'm only trusting that your understanding of white is the same understanding of white as me. But whatever it is, there's some kind of common ground, and the thing, the unity that brings us together in that understanding and that trust is the word white. That's the thing that we have, because I call it white. Is as much consensual as it is also a choice, right? Some people choose to live in hell. Some people choose to live in heaven.
You also make these films which you call kitchen shorts.
Yes.
And they're very funny because they just have the backdrop of a boiler in the kitchen.
Yes.
And then things happen in the films. And one of them, can you describe Sock Puppets? Because that's quite an amusing short film. Entirely, describe it to me because it's quite.
It's a satirical reflection of sort of documentary. I know lots of people have done this since, but I mean those kitchen shorts. I mean, I was candidly I was involved in a situation at that time in my life that was, and I was going out with this French woman called Sabine, and. Basically, she was a spook, and I was at a loose end at that time. And of course, Sabine, was doing her madness, and I was just at this house in Hackney, and I will always find a way to entertain myself. So I started making these mad things in her kitchen. It was an unfinished kitchen. The whole house, in fact, was unfinished. It was in a state of it was a sort of a cusp of development that might nevertheless be construed as being an atrophy. She was a fascinating woman, but my God, she was, dare I say it, dangerous. About it.
With the sock puppets, you have a hand in a white sock and a hand in a black sock, and they start having this conversation, and then they break out into a vicious fight with each other. Yeah. And it's really funny the way you've done that. Well, I thought it was hilariously funny. You took such a simple idea and made it into such a funny.
Yes, I mean the black and the white. I mean it is that duality. It is that sort of archetypal duality, and it is that that sort of fly on the wall documentary spectacle, isn't it? The sort of the desperate family who are just so impoverished and so repressed that they have nothing but to fight amongst themselves. And of course, what that's indicative of is the nature of control, of power, isn't it? That that Machiavellian divide and rule. And it's portrayed and manifest in so many aspects of our society.
Now you make music as well. I mean, you're a musician. You've got, I can see you lots of musical instruments
all over the place.
All over the place. And you just experiment with your own style of doing it, don't you? I mean, you don't follow any particular genre or rules. You just create music, which is
that your?
Well, I mean, it's rather like music I've heard at Kettle's Yard from time to time from artists.
Yes.
Music from artists tends to be rather different to music from musicians in a certain sense because you do different things with music.
I did start playing guitar when I was about 16. I wanted to be Eddie Van Halen, I wanted to be Jimi Hendrix, and of course everyone sort of that age in the 80s, the early 80s was sort of enthralled by all of that. But technically, I was never particularly good, and also, my attention span is profoundly unmethodical. I got into painting, and I was passionately involved in it, and it was very, 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 very all-encompassing for a long, long time, and I did that with a fully loaded cognitive understanding of it. I read, lots and lots and lots of books about what it is to paint. I needed to get a conception of it from other people's experience, and I applied that to what I was doing. But at the same time, I was very much aware that I had to find my own pathway in that. So, I felt that I was much more successful at drawings. I felt that there was a completion, that there was a sense of achievement there, and I applied myself to it in a sort of like a full-on sex golden porn film. and if you'll forgive me, I'll just finish, round it off. I got to the end of that, and I got to the end of it to the extent to which I literally couldn't draw anymore. I literally couldn't put my hand to the paper with a pencil in it, with the best intention. It was like two magnets opposed to each other. That was the end of it. I got to the end of that trip, and it was over. And then I started absolutely focusing on music, going back to that. And all of the things that I became aware of in myself through the process of painting and through the process of drawing, I realised were breaking that.
Sarah McCallum-Moore, thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with Cambridge 105. It's been great fun being here.
An absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure, Simon. Thank you so much.
Sometimes a new splash of well-considered colour is just what a house needs to up the tone and lift our spirits with visual themes that engage our imagination, provoking thought and expressing inner feelings. Cambridge artist Charlotte Cornish is exhibiting her newest work in her new studios in Arrington and captures the spirit of this year's Open Studios as she presents some of her best work yet and talks on what it might contain for the viewer perhaps looking for a positive environmental angle. She introduces the work and invites people in to see for themselves. Charlotte, tell me a little bit about yourself. You've been quite a prominent artist in Cambridge for quite some time now. What's been happening recently?
Well, the last few years have seen quite a few changes. I moved from a wonderful large studio that I was renting in Chesterton in Cambridge 4 years ago. And that was big. That was a big move. I'd been at that studio for 20 years and I wasn't sure I was going to find a good studio, but I found a fantastic studio in Arrington where I have settled in well. I've got light, I've got space, and I'm actually quite enjoying being in the countryside.
With your current series, obviously I haven't seen your paintings for a while because I haven't been in to see you, but you seem to have strengthened all the colours and what have you to create more impact, and they really are quite striking. What have you been doing?
Well, I think I have a sense, just generally, I suppose colour's always been the thing I've really loved working with. And maybe it's to do with confidence, or maybe it's a response to what's been happening with the last few years, which have been very difficult years in lots of different ways for us all. I think saturated colour is just something I love working with. And if I can get colour to play off each other, to be dynamic, to have a sense of intensity and vibrancy, it's just something I've always loved working with, but maybe I'm just doing it a little bit more boldly now.
It seems that you managed to capture a kind of energy and zing, which really shows in these images, because they're so bright, and they also seem to sort of play on lots of things in terms of desire and feeling in the mind as well.
Well, I think personal experience has always fed into my work. A huge amount of inspiration for my work comes from place. So it's either in years gone by travel abroad, and more recently much more the kind of British landscape and places that I've visited, and without a doubt my kind of emotional response or personal connection to those places feeds into the work. So there is a sense of landscape in them now, even though they're still abstracted, and there is a sense of kind of personal connection to those places.
These kind of look like new flowers or things springing up and new life coming into an equation that's full of greenery and what have you. Is there that kind of environmental streak running through them?
Well, there's two kind of things working in my work. There's a new language of a lot of vertical flicks and splashes that I've been working with for a number of years now. I used to have a lot more circles in my work, but I've moved slightly away from using circles. And this kind of visual dynamic of these verticals, without a doubt, have been taken from very much kind of landscape or growth themes. So rushes, reeds, plants growing, flowers, bamboo, all those kinds of vertical kinds of inspirations have fed into the work. But alongside that, it's because I also love the actual visual dynamic of working with these very powerful kind of verticals.
So these could be natural grasses or flowers growing, but they could also be like volcanic things, couldn't they? In the reds, when you're using the reds, they could be lava or something like that as well, couldn't they?
Well, I think what's so lovely about working in the way that I work, in the sense that I am abstracting forms and compositions from things I have seen, is that of course there is that opportunity for personal interpretation, and it's lovely that people can come and look at my work and take from it or see things in it that they're drawn to or that they resonate with. I try sometimes to have titles that hint at what the work's about, but I try not to be overly descriptive in a lot of the titles, so there is that room for personal interpretation. And this is the one time in the year where I speak to people about my work. I can have responses from them. It is a personal connection with people, and I really value it. Find me on my website, which is just my name, charlottecornish.co.uk, and also in the online Open Studios guide, which you can find by googling that. I think there's an app that goes with it, and I'm number 186 in the guide, which has a map and everything.
Charlotte, thank you very much indeed for talking to Cambridge 105. And that brings us to the end of an Elastic Arts Hour, and I hope we'll have your company again on Cambridge Arts Roundup. I'm Simon Bertin, and I'll be back soon with more from local creative people.